Thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here in New Zealand and Rotorua. It's my first time to New Zealand, how about that? I'm going to give a bit of an overview more about the digital, I suppose, and it's a bit of a story. We're going to start with climate, because when it comes to water, everything starts with climate. Oops, gotta get this away. What this is a graph of global temperatures. It's moving pretty quickly, and you'll see there that the temperatures are increasing across time, the different colours. And the reason for the hump there is the temperature across the globe varies. That went very quickly. I'm going to do that again in a second. I'm going to explain it first. So what this is the global temperatures, and you'll see that it varies with the different temperature as you go throughout in time. And the reason that is there's more land mass in the northern part of the world than there is in the south, and so on a global average it's hotter during their June and July period. The colours, and I'll take you through this again, show how the global temperature is increasing with time. So there it is, starting from the late 1800s, just moving. You can see that it varies. Sometimes it'll spike up a little bit and then it'll come down again, and gradually it's increasing. And overall we've had an increase in temperature by about 1 degree over the last century, and that's quite important. In Australia, as you probably know, we've got highly variable rainfall. We lurch from drought to flood and back again. The reason for that is, and this cartoon sort of illustrates it, is sorry, I'm losing my thought here. We go from that rain to the drought, back again, and the reform often happens in the drought periods in Australia. And the reason for that, and this is the point I was trying to get to, is that we're a large land mass, but we're an even larger ocean, and it's where those warm pools of water are sitting into the Pacific Ocean or in the Indian Ocean that largely determine how the rainfall comes across Australia. We're also one of the lowest countries in the world, continents in the world, and an average height of about 330 metres. So unlike New Zealand, very flat, a little bit of a hill with the Great Dividing Range, and so these weather patterns sweep pretty much across the nations. When you look at stream flow across the globe, and a piece of work here by Tom McMahon, one of Australia's best hydrologists, semi-retired these days, he looked at some 1,220 rivers across the world where the rivers were largely unaffected by development. And when you stack them up and you do it a coefficient of variation on the mean annual stream flow, you can see there that's Australia, and I've put our sort of rugby colours there. You'll see there that we're the third highest across the world in terms of that variability, and New Zealand is relatively stable, as you'd know. So it's got one of the more consistent flows in terms of stream flows, but Australia's right up there. When you look at the spread between the 10th percentile and the 90th percentile, we rank number one. By comparison, again, New Zealand, quite consistent stream flows. And the rest of the world there, and not all the countries are shown for the reasons of the data, but you can see there Australia's right up there in that variability. And that one reality drives a lot of water management in Australia. So this particular graphic is showing the impact of El Nino on two of our largest dams, Lake Hume and Dartmouth in Victoria and New South Wales. The top metric shows, with the fine white line, the rainfall anomaly, the variation from the mean as it varies in time from 1981 going through almost to the present point in time. The darker white line is the 6-month moving average. The red bars, and transposed down below in terms of the red outline with the changes in sort of storage level with the dams, is the El Nino period, those periods when it's much drier across Australia. So the bottom part, just to explain, that shows those two dams combined, the two important ones, and the percentage full. And you can see there we have these periods, and I'll just start here from the left, where it declines and then it doesn't recover during this El Nino period, and it collapses. And you can see there's a 72%, bit small to read, 72% decline over a year and a half. And then it gradually recovers again, and here's another failed period, drops to 59%. And you can see there, 72%, 59, 73, 64, etc. Over periods of no more than a year and a half, we can go from full or close to full to 20% or below. So this reality, again, drives water management across Australia, particularly in the rural area. So, as a result of that, in the middle of what we call the Millennium Drought from the early 2000s through to 2010, when some record floods came, there was a crisis in water management, particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin, which is our area through Victoria, New South Wales into the lower part of Queensland. We saw many dams and rivers run dry, and there was crisis. We had boiled water alerts in many towns, and at the peak of the drought in 2006, the concern had reached the highest levels of government. And the then Prime Minister, John Howard, called all the premiers together on our Cup Day, Melbourne Cup Day, the nation stops to watch that, and he called a crisis meeting of all the premiers and said, what are we going to do? And he devised a $10 billion plan to reform water management in Australia, and that was the point where the Commonwealth got involved, the Commonwealth, the Australian government. So how low did it get? So when you look at these major storages across the cities, plus the Murray-Darling Basin, you can see in many cases it got to 17%, and even Melbourne at 26%. And the Herald Sun is perhaps the tabloid newspaper, popular newspaper in Melbourne, and when it got to 29.9%, and it got lower as you can see, it was headlines on the front page. So it captured the imagination of the community, because it wasn't just farmers suffering in drought, but everyone was showering and had drought and restrictions. You know, people were showering literally in buckets to take the buckets and the water onto their gardens. So where is it now? As you can see, it's rebounded at the start of October, and it's largely recovered across many of these states, except for Perth, which has particular factors, very much the canary in the coal mine as far as climate change goes. So there was a number of simple questions that really were challenged to ask. How is water availability changing? Is there enough water to meet our needs? And how much do we have, and how is it shared? And those scarcity factors, which I won't go through in depth, but you can see there, they're all the various pressures on water and availability in Australia. So as a result of that, there was a number of Australian government water reforms, a bit of a journey if you like, and we can see there some of those started before the Millennium Drought. In 1994 there was a reform framework, the National Water Initiative, that gets a bit of attention, quite a comprehensive plan of actions, of which I've highlighted those key interventions with the graphic there about improving the environmental management, transforming how water is allocated so it's a share of the resource, so in times of shortage you have a reduced share and there is a proper mechanism for resolving that, and also modernising some institutional arrangements. So that's always fun, but making sure that we had the appropriate management. I should actually say at this point that water management in Australia is a state responsibility. It's not an Australian government one or a Commonwealth, but the crisis enabled the government to come in and intervene. And the final thing, which is where the Bureau of Meteorology came in, when it was finally announced, the $10 billion went to almost $13 billion, and $400 million was given to the Bureau of Meteorology over 10 years to enhance water management. So we expanded the role of the Bureau of Meteorology, a bit like your Met Service and a bit like NIWA, but mainly the Met Service, and it was expanded to bring in hydrology and to bring water information to the nation to help guide decision making by governments and individuals. So what did? We ended up having a copy. There was lots of water information in over 200 water entities across Australia, but they kept it and managed it for their own purposes. They could nicely manage their own business, but didn't get a national view. So particularly with the Murray-Darling Basin covering 4 states, you couldn't pull together the overall picture. So copies of that information comes to us. We get some 13,000 files a day that come into the Bureau of Meteorology. We've got now over 4 billion time series observations in the single large database, and this graphic here shows we've got over 850 groundwater bores, we call them. I'm not sure if you call them wells in New Zealand, but different language. And you can see just how extensive groundwater use is across Australia, particularly for rural purposes. Some of the capital cities and some of the regional centres particularly use groundwater as their primary source. So moving forward, what did we see? We pretty much, it's common that you see monitoring and quality assurance and archiving and local reporting. That occurs frequently. But what was less occurring was that sharing that information and integrating it. And ultimately, how do you pull that together to model, analyse, report, and ultimately forecast, which is more rare? What we're on about is taking that information from data to information to gain insight And the slides that I'm going to talk about from here on in will give you some practical examples of how we did that. But first of all, how can water information be used? It can be used to assess how we've come from, where we're going to in the future, to evaluate things, to foresight, to have a sense of those changing ocean dynamics and how that influences our weather, and to be accountable. And there's often reviews that occur, and you've got one coming here. Ours often come as a result of droughts and floods, perhaps. And then education to explain to the community so they can understand and bust myths. So the next slide here illustrates how it all comes together in one slide. So at the top there, we've got the Bureau of Meteorology's automatic weather stations, radars and satellites and so forth. And all that goes into numerical weather prediction models, and the rainfall forecasts come out. And added to that is the information from the water sector, like all your councils and your big water utilities. All of that comes together from rivers and dams and groundwater into that database that I was referring to. Now, not everything goes into a hydrological model, but some of the products do. And to give you a broad indication, we'll touch on just some of those. You can get the situational analysis. You can look on your phone and find about water storage across the nation, stream flow, groundwater. You look at how does that compare to the past. So you can look at streams and what's it varying in terms of climate. We do water resource assessments every second year, and design rainfalls, which I'll touch on some more later. And of course, the one that everyone understands is forecasting on floods, stream flows, whether it's on a short-term basis or seasonal. So let's see, well, how do you find it? And by the way, if any of you are interested in the slides, just give me your card, put presentation on it, and I'll send you a PDF copy. But you go to our webpage, and then if you click down below the line, as we call it, you'll see water information. You click on that, and you get this similar categorisation of information: water data, water status, and water forecast. And we're going to have a look at the water data online. So just from, it works best off a laptop or a computer, but you can see there all the locations where we've got water information, flow statistics across the nation. So we drill in on one of those, being the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Water's seat. So we'll have a look at the Peel River. And you can see here, particularly on the right-hand side, there's a menu there, and you may not all be able to read it, but you can have a look at the record in the past, as in this example. You can look at flow frequency analysis, so the return period, and in this case here, the watercourse level. So if you're interested in floods, you can go by year analysis, and all of that information, which I'll only just touch on, you can have a look if you like. So all of that's now compiled and analysed. You frankly don't, I'll probably upset some people, by the way, I'm an engineer by training, so you don't actually need a hydrologist. For that simple information, you just go and do it yourself. So let's have a look at Insight for Design Rainfall, and I know there's been some interest in New Zealand to see if you can get this up and running. So we updated the Australian Rainfall and Runoff, one of the design manuals for hydrology in Australia, and it can be used for a variety of purposes at different timescales, so from water-sensitive urban design to obviously to culverts and bridges at longer things, and critical infrastructure out to, say, 1 in 2,000 year, or even for dam safety, might be even up to 1 in a million year frequency. So we've got this rainfall information for the nation sort of analysed, and we updated it from the earlier version, and with all that information we've got from water utilities, got extra sites, extra record, using better analysis techniques in terms of the technical techniques. And Janice Green, who ran this project, I think is coming across to New Zealand early next year at the invitation of Water New Zealand, so you'll be able to hear more from her, and some different gridding analysis. So you can go in online, you can download the Australian Rainfall and Runoff, either as it was or the new IFDs, and you can see here that we've got standard durations or depths for different time periods, depending on the purpose of which you're using the information for, and standard probabilities across those ranges. You can use that to gain insight, that point that I made earlier. So this is an example of some heavy rain and some flooding we had in Tasmania earlier this year. And you can see that we had very substantial rainfalls up to 400 millimetres. Now that may or may not be a lot for New Zealand, and I think get some pretty heavy rains here, but for that part of Tasmania, which is a cooler part, those sort of rainfalls are pretty high. And what we've got on the left-hand side of the screen there is the depth by duration. You can see there as it steps up, and you can examine them. So for example there, for that duration there, let's just do that again, you can see that that was well beyond that 1% annual exceedance probability, or 1 in 100 years if you want to be rough in your terminology. And you can see that's the sort of response we got from the river coming into Launceston. So it was almost looks like a surf beach. So it was very extreme rainfall, and the flood defences around Launceston just managed to keep that one at bay. One of the things that we also do, remember we're going from forecasting through to rainfall and response, is we do high resolution seasonal forecasts. So that's where we're doing the rainfall forecast out to 3 months in advance. So we do 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and with some new investment, we're enhancing the predictability that we can do behind that. So on the right-hand side, the fairly coarse grid you've got there, currently we analyse rainfall. This is what these particular plots are here, the mean rainfall as simulated for August. And you can see there, that's the current resolution at 250 kilometres. And poor old Tasmania doesn't even get resolved at that resolution. In the middle is the observation, so that's the truth, if you like. And on the far left is or my left, your right, sorry, is the new resolution at some 60 kilometres. So it's far finer resolution. And the reason we can do that is some investment in the Australian government. We work closely with the UK Met Office in terms of their model stack, but we've also got a brand new supercomputer. Now it is very powerful. It can calculate what they call a floating point operation, and it can calculate 1,660 trillion, or that's 1,660 times a million, floating point operations at a teraflop per second. So it's got huge computing capability, and that's why we can do this sort of analysis. And if you just zoom in, for example, on Victoria there, you can see on I'll just point to my side, it'll be easier. My side, you can see they're fairly coarse, reality in the middle, and you can see the Great Divide Range at least gets some chance of being resolved. Moving forward, we can also do this for streamflow forecasts, so again, up to 3 months out, and we just represent how this is, particularly, say, to the farming community or those who are dam storage operators as terciles. So more orange means it's a drier likelihood into that period of time. More blue means wetter. So that's just the output, if you like. For water managers, and we've particularly done some work with Melbourne Water and helping them in terms of their streamflow forecast. So there's a shot of the Melbourne system, and there's 5 points where we're working with them to do those streamflow forecasts. That helps them in a number of ways. So for example, if you just look at, there's a plot there, the cumulative plot of flows by time in 2014, and the light blue line is the statistical average, if you like, and the median's going through the centre. And those green triangles show the forecast that the Bureau produces. So you can see there, even though we've got a statistical average that's higher, we forecast 3 months out into that first triangle, and the dark blue line is what actually occurred, and then the next 3 months, the next 3 months. Now we do that every month. In fact, we're moving to every week shortly. So you can see there, you could either just assume the past climatological average, or given those ocean dynamics again, run that into the models and produce it, and you can actually get a narrow window of what might occur. So that's again important in terms of managing storages. This particular histogram here shows the red line through the centre is the climatological average, and the blue line shows what we actually achieve. So we're getting a higher skill or hit rate, was it correct or not? And you can see there, if you just use the climatological average, then it was a much lower outcome. So you get more insight in terms of optimising your storages. And similarly, you can do that for water managers, so environmental water managers. This may or may not be something you do in New Zealand, but in Australia, because of these drier periods and also because of the extent of harvesting of water with dams, we've had to intervene in more recent years to try and restore environmental water. So what we can do there is forecast the likely rainfall and the inflows. So when a water manager, for example, releases water from Hume Reservoir, that they can choose to piggyback because they know what that forecast rain's coming through. So they can maximise the use of that fairly precious environmental water. And that's just a shot there of a wetland, the Barmah Forest wetlands, which are particularly important, and some affirmation there from the Murray-Darling Basin Authority about the importance and value to two of them. Insights for primary industry. So for those into modelling, we actually do a national hydrological model. So this is where observations are across the country. So again, typically around the coast. So a lot of the country we don't have observations for. So we've done a hydrological model, a water balance, if you like, for the nation on a 5x5k grid. And we won't go through all the steps there, but you can see there it's a deep drainage sort of model, and you can get various outputs from that. And the way that represents to the end user is as shown on this slide here. So you can zoom in on a part of the world. This one here is again showing near Goulburn in New South Wales, and you can see there's that little graphic there showing how soil moisture changes. So you can get soil moisture at different levels, as well as evapotranspiration, rainfall runoff, and so forth. So just that extra insight for primary industry has proved to be particularly valuable. We also pull that information together about how water is using and changing across the nation. So this is a shot here showing various sources of water supply for our major capital cities. And you can see there blue is the dams, but in particular look at Perth over in Western Australia. The brown there is groundwater supply. The lighter green above that is desalinated water. And you can see there how they've had to make greater use of groundwater, and particularly desalinated water over time. So unlike the other cities, Perth being the sort of canary in the coal mine, it's had to adapt to a situation where last year they evaporated more water from their dams than they got in inflows. Right? They had a minus 7 gigalitres, if I recall correctly. So they've actually had to adapt from a surface water situation to one where they're now, it's a bonus if they're getting water in their dams. They use their dams, the reason why it's in blue, they use the dams there to store the desalinated water. So you can get that sense of history over time by pulling this information together. Insight into groundwater, and we're not doing, the Bureau doesn't do much in terms of groundwater quality apart from salinity, but you can drill in onto a particular location in the centre there. You can get the hydrographs, the bars either side, the 25th and 75th percentile. We overlay that with the rainfall so you can see how the groundwater is responding over time. You also, with your mobile devices, have a look at salinity and also water entitlements. So I'm just going to give you a few concluding thoughts here. And this is really pointing, I suppose, at the technology, maybe the digital part. So whilst I haven't drilled in any great depth today, at the heart of what the Bureau and organisations like NIWA and Met Service do is high-resolution models. We replicate how the weather is performing by finer and finer grid resolution, and that's one way you get accuracy. The second way you get increased accuracy is remote sensing, and the Himawari 8 Japan satellite that we benefit from, I think New Zealand does as well, we get 292 billion data points per year for that. And a portion of that goes into our numerical models. So you need high-performance computers to run all that. You can do risk-based ensemble predictions, and you can do more analytics, and you can verify and prove that it's more accurate than you had before. On the other side of the fence, if you like, in the industry side, we're getting increased production system and pool. So we're using sensors a lot more in agriculture. The centre little box there, the one that's the small print says forecasting to decision system, South East Water, one of the urban retailers in Melbourne, uses these devices to run its pressurised sewage system tanks. So it can actually shut them down, if you like, when you're getting rainfall occurring, because you get infiltration into sewer systems, and can smooth the demand. And they can also use those for rainwater tanks. So with all that there, you can take all the normal data that you get out of numerical weather predictions. You can take some of the interpreter products, some of which I've touched on today. You can do the bespoke services, like you can buy from some of your med agencies, or you can put increasingly APIs, those programmable interfaces that people can use to make new devices from. So that insight is what's coming with greater technology and demand. And finally, my last slide here is a shot from New York Times, and it says, water is broken, but data can fix it. So you can find all sorts of statistics about Google Books and anything else, but with water, the real challenge is information and data to get that insight. And so the closing thought here is that that knowledge and that thirst for more, in the case of Australia, because it's so variable, drives a need for change behaviour and ignites innovation. So thanks for your thoughts today. I'm not sure if we've got any time left, but if you do, we could take one or two questions, but I don't want to sneak time off the other speakers. Thanks very much.
So we've got time for a couple of quick questions. If you do want to ask a question, if you can stand up and say your name and affiliation before you ask a question, that'd be great. Do we have any questions?
Scott Wilkinson, Opus. I was just wondering, are you sort of monitoring your groundwater levels as well?
Yes, we do, but first and foremost, because water management is a state responsibility, it's the states and particularly the water utilities that exist under their control that have got the primary responsibility. But what we do is take that data and provide that in a nationally consistent fashion, like I showed before. So you can get it off a state database, but for some of the states, they've got less resources and capability. And also some of the companies, I can think of one big mining company that prefer to come in through the Bureau because it's one place, don't have to go shopping around, because they work nationally, don't have to go shopping around and looking at all the different formats that the states have. So it's a question of national consistency insight that we can give, but the underlying management responsibility sits with states and their entities.
Places like Perth depleting their groundwaters?
No, look, Perth's doing a magnificent job in terms of managing that. They have had challenges in the past with Nangara Mound, if I've said it right. They're actually going into treated recharge, so treated effluent through reverse osmosis. So they get it to drinking water standard, then putting it back into, re-injecting into the groundwater, storing it and pulling it out 20 or 30 years later. So no, Perth's doing a great job. In fact, Perth's just a wonderful place. The Water Corporation, Western Australia, is just a great place to look at water management.